You know that kind of annoying but also kind of true meme about how the Porsche 911 is just a glorified Volkswagen Beetle? Well, it's not the only Porsche to share serious DNA with a Volkswagen. The most egregious of which is one that I originally disliked up until recording this video, up until doing the research for this video. But the more I read about it, the more I liked it, the more I appreciated it for what it was. I'm talking about Porsche's first ever mid-engine production car, the 914. The Porsche 911 is one of, if not the greatest sports cars ever made. The original 911 generation is a timeless design that not only launched an iconic style that still carries over today, but it also delivered a fantastic handling sports car. The flat six engine mounted behind the rear axle shouldn't work, but here we are 70 years later, and the 911 is still the undisputed king around circuits. But did you know that a flat six wasn't your only option back then? A Volkswagen Type 4 2-liter flat 4 was also an option on the entry-level 912. It looked identical to a 911, but it was slower, cheaper, and more economical. While the first 911S models made over 130 horsepower, the 912s had at best 102. But they still weighed 2,100 pounds, and were arguably better to drive than the 911s of that era since there was less weight behind the rear axle, so it wasn't quite as difficult to drive. No surprise then that it won the European Rally Championship in 1967, because every vehicle Porsche's ever built has to have some form of motorsport career, doesn't it? And in fact, between 1965 and 1969, over 30,000 912s were produced, with the 100,000th Porsche ever made being a 912 police car. But even still, Porsche wanted a replacement. A replacement that wasn't just an engine swap 911. And as luck would have it, Volkswagen also needed a replacement for their Carbon Ghia. Now previously, Porsche and Volkswagen had had a pretty cozy partnership of various involvements since Volkswagen's founding in the 1930s, and they entered another joint venture to kill two birds with one stone. Porsche designer Henrik Keil is credited with the design of what was to come, and that is a very important element because of what happened next. Volkswagen's chairman Heinrich Norschhoff died in 1968 just as the first concept rolled out, and the new guy, Kurt Lotz, decided that the verbal agreement between Porsche and Volkswagen that had been around for over 20 years was irrelevant. He figured that the 914 was all Volkswagen's if Porsche didn't pony up some cash. And, well, Porsche didn't have much of a choice to agree, since they'd already begun changing their assembly lines over from the 912 to the 914. But what it meant is that this entry-level Porsche wasn't quite so entry-level. It was only a few grand cheaper than the 911, with 45 horsepower less. In fact, the only thing Lotz did that could be considered smart was allow Porsche to sell it as the Porsche 914 in America instead of the Volkswagen Porsche 914 that was sold in Europe, because nobody would ever take a Volkswagen Porsche seriously in America. They just wouldn't. So the Porsche 914 debuted in 1969 to sales and acclaim. Motor Trend called it their import car of the year, and it outsold the 911 by a good margin. So how? I mean, why are people clamoring to get their hands on a car with a Volkswagen 4-cylinder that is built by Carmen that was only designed by Porsche? Simple. It was their first ever mid-engine production car. And I see you typing in the comments about the 3561. Stop it. Building one car in 1948 does not qualify as a production car, even if it is road legal. And besides, Porsche had a better option than an 80 horsepower Volkswagen 4-cylinder. they had a 2-liter flat 6 from the 911. The base 911, so it made 109 horsepower and 118 torque, but a 911 nonetheless. And it was mounted to a 5-speed manual transmission with McPherson strut suspension up front. The 914-6 was the heaviest 914 ever made at 2,200 pounds, but look at it this way. It's almost the exact same weight as the previous 912, but it had more power, better weight distribution, disc brakes, and a proper 911 soundtrack. In 1970, the 914-6 had a top speed of 130 miles an hour and did 0 to 60 in 8.7 seconds, which isn't that good, I will admit, but that is still a decent figure for the 1970s, and the 914 was more about the corners anyway. It's not a dragster now, is it? No surprise then, given Porsche's history and the handling prowess of the 914, that they took it racing. And in order to do that, they needed a racing version, called the 914-6 GT. This was stripped out to weigh under a ton, and had a retuned 911 engine to make 207 horsepower from just 2 liters of naturally aspirated displacement. Those are S2000 levels of power to displacement ratio. 30 years before the S2000 came out, it was a force to be reckoned with in the SCCA, and even managed to punch above its weight in Europe. It entered the GT 2-liter class of the 1970 24 Hours of Le Mans, and despite going up against 911s, it won its class and finished 6th overall, 4 laps clear of one of the Ferrari 312P prototype cars. But more important than any of its racing achievements was its actions in the 1973 F1 World Championship. That year's Canadian Grand Prix was raining. A lot. I'm talking Noah's Ark levels of a lot. And after several accidents occurred in the treacherous conditions, the officials decided to try out their new toy, the safety car, specifically a bright yellow Porsche 914, and while it kept people safe for the first time in F1, it also caused absolute chaos for the officials. There wasn't a computer counting who was on what lap, and the safety car confused the hell out of everyone's lap charts. Mainly because the safety car was deployed in front of the wrong vehicle. Oops. It was deployed in front of Howden Ganley's Izzo, and everyone just updated their lap charts to say he overtook everyone. Because, he overtakes half the field in half a lap. He's a very good driver, apparently. In the end, Peter Revson's McLaren was classified as the winner after 3 hours of post-race deliberation. And funnily enough, the safety car wasn't used again in F1 until 1992. That safety car was a true pioneer, a different type of pioneer in motorsport, but a very important car in motorsport nonetheless. And with over 115,000 914s sold in its production run, a few were definitely bound to be a bit more interesting than the others. For example, Giorgetto Giugiaro from Ital Design built their Tapiro on the basis of a 914-6. It was an early example of the wedge design style and featured sick gull-wing doors. And then it burned to the ground. But Giugiaro was not the only famous designer to use the 914 as a basis. Albrecht von Gotz built a shooting brake version of the 914 in his time. Even GM got in on the action with the XP897 GT, which was a concept for the new rotary-powered Corvette. But since GM didn't have a mid-engine platform yet, they ended up with a 914 chassis as one of the strangest Corvettes ever made. But Porsche themselves arguably made the best one, a humble-looking 914 given to Ferry Porsche as a birthday present. But it did not go like a humble old 914 because it had a naturally aspirated flat 8 engine from their 908 Le Mans prototype, making 300 horsepower, with the development car making 350. That is the same power-to-weight ratio as a current-gen 911 GT3 RS. Apparently, Ferry didn't like it very much, which is kind of rude in my opinion, and both cars currently reside inside the Porsche Museum. And I can only guess he didn't like it because having that power-to-weight ratio with that car and that aerodynamics in that time sounds absolutely terrifying. But even these brilliant and wacky vehicles couldn't save the 914, which was retired in 1976 to be replaced by the front-engine 924, except in America, where they really wanted to sell some four-cylinder cars, but the 924 hadn't entered production yet, which meant that in America, at least, the successor to the 914 was the 912, the car that the 914 replaced. Just over 2,000 912Es were built in 1976 and is described as the only example of planned obsolescence in Porsche's history. When the 924 did start selling worldwide in 1977, it had even more success than the 914, selling over 150,000 cars and launching an entire front-engine model range, including the 944 and the 968. Also, interesting bit of trivia, it had the third different four-cylinder engine placement in the first three models. The 912 was rear-engine, the 914 was mid-engine, and the 924 was front-engine, just gradually making from the rear of the car to the front of the car. And in fact, Porsche would not return to the 914's layout until the Boxster in 1996, a design they stuck with until their transition to electric vehicles in the coming years. And it was the 914 that first pointed them in that direction.